really create a form of threat and to really examine how it is that people deal with this threat. And we have a sample of women scientists, so I want to tell you about that work. This is the clicker, right? Down. This is the clicker? Yes, got it, down, thank you. And so I just wanted to highlight that this is our research team, and mostly from Teachers College, Columbia University. Mateo Cruz is now at Bentley University, and we've been working on this together for a long time. So I wanted to acknowledge their work in this project. And just to set the context, because I think the context matters a lot in terms of what are the conditions that can create invisibility. So if we look at women in STEM, what we see is that for everybody who enters college to obtain a BA, only 12 will graduate with a degree in STEM, and of those women, in 2 years, only 5 are working in STEM, and then 10 years after that, only 2. And if you decide to go into academics, it's actually not a very pretty picture. Now, this is based on chemistry, but what we see is that women are leaking out of the pipeline, and that's a term that is used to describe the experience of women in STEM. And so this is a phenomenon that exists in the world, and people are devoting a lot of energy to explaining why is this the case, what's happening. So what I want to do is just talk a little bit about the dominant discourse, because this is something that Lewis and Simpson say is really important in terms of really understanding what's going on. So I have a couple quotes here about people in power and how people in power explain why there are so few women. And the first one is a quote by Lawrence Summers. And this is when he was president of Harvard. He actually had to leave Harvard after this. But the gist of this quote is that it is the deficits that women have at the extreme ends of the distribution in science and math. Now, he was also Sheryl Sandberg's mentor. Okay, now that you could say, well, that's a long time ago, Caryn, right? That was 2005. But then I have this quote, and this is from somebody who won the Nobel Prize in 2015. It says, "Let me tell you about my trouble with girls. 3 things happen when they are in the lab. You fall in love with them, they fall in love with you, and when you criticize them, they cry." He had to step down too. But this is the dominant discourse. Part of the dominant discourse about why there are so few women in STEM is that there are deficits that women have. And so what we wanted to study in this particular research is how is it that these explanations about group deficits is the reason for women's underrepresentation in STEM fields. So I'm just going to do this so I don't have to keep turning around. Sorry about that. Okay. So how might this heighten the visibility of their gender identity? And also, how might this heighten the invisibility of their professional identity, if this is what is used to explain why so few? So we called this systemic stereotype threat, which is a chronic threat that occurs when an individual is in a system that is characterized by gender or racial disparities, and the dominant discourse about the reason for these disparities is stereotypes about the deficits of women and people of color rather than systemic inequalities. And because it's hard to see something that's invisible, I love this particular graphic, which you can find online. Just Google Stereotype Threat. But are they in the same situation? Sure, they're both performing math and they're both making a mistake. But look at the dominant discourse. In one case, it's an individual mistake. In the other case, she's representing all girls. So stereotype threat is an acute situational threat that puts you at risk of confirming a negative stereotype about your group. And Claude Steele, when he first coined the term, talked about it as a threat in the air, meaning it is like ever present and we never see it. So stereotype threat is a threat that we can't see, and we reduce people fear being reduced to the stigmatized group, and it can impact performance. And I think what's wonderful about stereotype threat is that it's been studied with everybody. So it isn't just something that happens to women and people of color, it happens to white men on social sensitivity tasks. It happens to whites if you tell them, you're about to engage in a conversation that's going to tell us how racist you are. So that's, stereotype threat is really a wonderful theory because it really does talk about that this happens to everybody. And yet the problem with this research is that it's mostly been done in the lab, and it results in a static picture because people have to cope with this over their whole career. So we were interested in how does this happen? And we were particularly interested in how women scientists navigate this, what strategies they use. Do they differ? Does everybody approach this the same way? And what are costs and benefits? So we had a sample of 26 women in a top-tier research university who are scientists. We sampled them by career stage, because we thought that might make a difference in specialization. And it was funded through an NSF Advance grant to improve women in the sciences. We used a qualitative theory elaboration approach, which basically means we did start out coding with existing strategies, but we added to it because there was much that wasn't there. So our sample was mostly white women, and I'll talk about the implications of that at the end, because that is intersectional, and how white women cope may not be how others cope. But we did randomly contact women who were at this institution, and we did make sure that we had distribution across age, gender, and there wasn't much racial diversity in this sample. We had a lot of international participants, and they did come from different areas of the sciences. So what did we find? One thing we found was that the effects are more than just affecting their performance. It affected how they themselves self-regulated and thought about the threat. It affected how they interacted with colleagues, and it affected decisions about how to interact with the system. So let me just quickly show you what we found, these major 3 response patterns. And the first response pattern was what most of the junior women did, and we call that fending off the threat, which is demonstrating that the threat isn't going to apply to you. So they downplayed the threat and thought it would be generational. They blamed themselves when they were in a situation where they were made invisible, made an internal attribution. If only I prepared for that presentation more, then it would have been better. They over-efforted, which for us means they worked hard, they made their work, they didn't tolerate a mistake. And they also tended to work alone, because they didn't want people to see that they were struggling. So I have a quote here, and to me it's the Hermione Granger effect. Here I reworked my papers over and over until I couldn't find anything more to fix before sending them off. I kept adding and checking references. 2 of my papers were accepted with no changes requested. One of them was even being typeset at the time that they notified me that it was accepted for publication. What did I do? I called and told them that I had some changes that I wanted to make. What a waste. In the same time and with the same energy, I could have written 3 papers, not 1. So that's the first written out. Can I go backwards? Yes. There we go. The second response pattern, what we only saw with more mid-career to senior women, and this was what we called confronting the threat, a very different strategy, which was to stand up for yourself or your group when you felt like you were being threatened. So very productive, but it was revenge productivity. I'm going to show them. A lot more advocacy work, working with women's groups, taking on roles as diversity officers, more collaboration with women, and some actually decided to work outside the system. Now I have a quote here as well, which is, it's almost like, because you're a woman, what comes out of your mouth seems less credible than any stupid shit that any man ever shot off his mouth. I thought it was a generational thing, but it's not. I'd like to think that I'm trying to help the women that I have an impact on. That's important to me, to make it easier for them to be who they are. I still get pissed off. I still get angry. It's really hard not to. So, and what these women really stayed in this pattern, but they were really angry. So eventually, both burnout and system inertia led some women, if they didn't leave, to actually stay, and we called the third pattern, which was only senior women, sustaining self in the present of threat, which meant that they saw the threat, but they knew they couldn't fight every battle because they would literally be burned out. They also redefined their criteria for success. Maybe I won't be that full, chaired, named professor, but I'm going to figure out what I can do in this system. They chose their battles, and they were aware of their benefits of their gender. They weren't hiding it. And they really wanted to change the game of science. So some of them went into uncontested areas. And I actually had 3 quotes here because I couldn't do only 1. But the first one's about the love of science. And so what they found that they felt good about was that you've got to follow what it is that's important to you. So that's redefining success. The second quote's great. It was a British woman. I go off to these committee meetings and I'm the only woman. They're all very male-dominated, and they're all very, by and large, quite pompous. I look at it as, where is there an opportunity for doing what I want to do and get moving, and that's it. Now, the third quote is about someone who did change the science, and what she did was actually find new areas, and it was in polar ice caps that hadn't been examined before. She actually has a glacier named after her right now, and she's at the head of the president of one of the most important professional associations in her area. So I have, and I didn't find anything in the popular press that really looked like this. So this is, participants said I could use this, and she was invited to speak as the only woman on a manel. I've heard that term now, a manel, 15 people. And it was at the Italian embassy, and she got up to speak, and this was the picture that was behind her. It's the Italian embassy. They have tapestries. And so the reason that this is sustaining herself, because she didn't get derailed, she actually realized this is the threat, and so she had someone take a picture of her so she could document it and know that's what she survived. One more minute. Okay. So I guess all I want to say, and it's all in the article, so that's the good news. There are costs and benefits of each, and that's the important point. There isn't a way that women don't have to worry about this, but I just wanted to mention a couple other things, and one is that it really did depend on their understanding of the dominant discourse, what it was that they did. So women in fending off the threat, they really did accept the discourse that women didn't have what it takes, so they did really try to keep their gender invisible to others, but keep the systemic threat invisible to themselves. Women in confronting threat, they reject the dominant discourse, and they wanted to make that threat visible. Women in the sustaining self knew, they saw the threat, but they weren't controlled by it, and they recognized it as like a lifelong dilemma that they would have to navigate. And then I just quickly, conclusions and implications are that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach for women. And some of us are going to be in all these patterns. So if some women don't want to go to a women's leadership program, that's okay. And if some women don't want to be on a panel, that's okay, because we're all going to approach it differently. Also, that nobody is immune. We identified a different type of invisible labor, which is the cognitive and emotional labor of having to figure this out. And then, really importantly, we need to change our reliance on a meritocracy narrative, because the meritocracy narrative, in light of these disparities, really creates these conditions. And then really quickly, one of the biggest limitations, as I said earlier, was that we had a sample of white women. And Claude Steele talks about that some groups just have better individual and collective strategies for dealing with stereotype threat because they're more sophisticated. White women are socialized that we can do anything. So one of the things that we really need to do in this research is to look at this with other more experienced groups. And Bella Nicomo's classic work on black and white managers shows that there's a big difference in how black and white women navigate these situations. And then next is we do need to understand individual and contextual factors that predict these different response patterns, and do this in a variety of settings. And the only way to do this is to develop a measure of response patterns to stereotype threat. And that's what Mateo Cruz is doing today, is developing that measure, and he will propose a week from today. Thank you very much. Sorry to run over.